There was one place on Earth where a single air raid could cut the United States Navy in half. Not a city, not a battleship, a canal, 50 miles of locks and concrete through Panama, the only door between America's two oceans. Wreck one set of lock gates, sink one ship in the right channel, and every warship in the Atlantic faces weeks of hard sailing around South America to reach a war in the Pacific. The men who planned America's defense called the canal the most vulnerable point in the hemisphere, and they knew something the public did not. In a fleet exercise at the end of the 20s, carrier aircraft launched from far out at sea reached the canal unseen and on paper destroyed it. No warning, no defense, a practice war, and the door was already swinging. 10 years later, the airplanes were twice as fast, the carriers were better, and the warning time was still the same. 0. By 1940, America had radar. The first early warning sets in the nation's defense went not to New York, not to Washington. They went to Panama. And the men who ran them discovered, almost at once, a flaw so dangerous that it was pushed toward top secret. The radar could not see low. A plane that came in wave-hopping a few feet above the water slid in under the lowest edge of the beam and arrived with no warning at all. The door to America's oceans stood open at the bottom. The fix the Army wanted sounds simple. Put radar on ships and push the ships 100 miles out to sea. But a radar small enough for that job did not exist. Its heart would have to be a single glass bottle with 250,000 watts sealed inside it. And American industry refused to attempt the bottle. This is the story of that tube. It was built for a ship that never sailed. Instead, it went ashore on the beaches of the whole war, carried on the backs of 4 men, seeing 110 miles. Hold the picture of June 1940. France is falling. The war is a year and a half away from America, and most Americans want to keep it that way. And in that exact month, 2 crates leave Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, in a hurry. Inside them are 2 of the first early warning radar sets the United States Army owns. One goes to Fort Sherman on the Atlantic mouth of the Panama Canal. The other crosses the isthmus to a small island called Tobago in the Gulf of Panama facing the Pacific. That is how scared the planners were and how clearly they had read the map. The sets worked. That was the good news. A long-wave radar of that generation could throw a pulse far over the sea and catch a formation of aircraft 100 miles out, high in the clean air. The bad news arrived as soon as the operators started thinking like the enemy. The pulse travels in a straight line. The ocean curves. So at long range, the beam passes high over the water. And underneath it, there is a gap. A pilot who knew the gap was there could drop his airplane onto the wave tops and ride that blind lane all the way in. The crews called it wave hopping. And that fact was quietly escalated until it sat just short of top secret, because the fence around America's most vital point had a hole at the bottom, and the only people who knew were the ones praying nobody else figured it out. Then came Pearl Harbor, and nobody had to imagine the night raid anymore. Everyone had seen one. What that did to the canal's defenders is preserved, word for word, in the records of a Washington conference from March 1942. The Army's official historians later wrote the situation down with unusual bluntness. Panama's air defenses were weak. The detector system was barely half effective, and it was well that no enemy attempted to blast the canal. The crews in the canal zone had radar sets they did not fully understand, because the trained operators had been stripped away after Pearl Harbor and replaced with whoever could be found. Into that room walked the question of what to do about it, and the transcript reads like men who believe the next attack could come tomorrow. General Colton, the head of Signal Corps engineering, wanted the new sets held back long enough to train crews on them. Sending equipment without trained men, he told the room, was idiotic. He lost the argument in the space of a minute, because the other side of it was not technical at all. Suppose the Japanese strike the canal next week, and the sets are sitting in New Jersey with instructors. Who explains that? The sets went, trained crews or not. A colonel named Mariner summed up the mood of the room in one line: "We will fix up Panama, or else." Another officer, a Signal Corps colonel named Meade, who knew the theatre, put it even more plainly: "If anybody in this room decides anything is ahead of Panama, that person will soon occupy a different position. And above all of them, the White House." President Roosevelt personally directed that the first 4 sets off the new Canadian production line go to Panama. Guns were arriving in the canal zone, searchlights, interceptors, but none of that answered the wave hopper, because you cannot shoot what you cannot see coming. The only real answer was to move the eyes themselves. Take the radar off the land, put it on small ships, and station those ships 100 miles or so off each entrance of the canal. Picket ships, floating eyes, far enough out that even a low flyer would be seen with time to spare. On a staff map, it was elegant. In an equipment catalogue, it was impossible, because the radar that existed could not go to sea like that. The Army's long-wave sets were monsters. Antennas the size of billboards, trailers, generators, tons of steel. You could not hang that on a 100-foot patrol boat and keep it working in a seaway. A picket radar would have to be small. To be small, it would have to use a much shorter wave, a much higher frequency than any set the Army owned. And to do that, it needed a transmitter tube that could pour out enormous power at a frequency where in 1940, no production tube in America could pour out much of anything. The Navy had warships. The Army had a requirement, and between them stood a piece of glass that did not exist. How do you build the one component every manufacturer in America says cannot be built? That question landed in a laboratory the Signal Corps had set up at Fort Monmouth precisely because industry kept saying no. The Army's official history describes the lab's purpose in one dry, devastating line. It existed to turn out radar tubes of types so complex that industry hesitated to attempt them. When the companies looked at a job like this one and saw years of development for a market of one customer, the Army's answer was to grow its own tube men. One of them was a physicist named Harold Zahl. He had joined the Signal Corps laboratories back in 1931, in the lean years, when the whole American military radio establishment could fit in a few rooms. By 1940, he had spent a decade learning exactly where the limits of vacuum tubes were. Now he was being asked to move one. The arithmetic of the problem was brutal in a quiet, technical way. The picket radar needed a wavelength of about 50 centimeters, 600 megacycles, more than 5 times the frequency of the long-wave sets guarding Panama. At that frequency, an antenna shrinks from a billboard to a dish a few feet across. That is what makes the set small enough for a boat. But in 1940, 600 megacycles was the Badlands. And the reason was not power in the raw sense, it was geometry. At those frequencies, every inch of wire inside a transmitter starts to behave badly. A lead the length of your finger stops being a connection and becomes a leak. The circuit does not live on the workbench anymore. It lives inside the tube, or it does not live at all. A conventional tube at 600 megacycles could whisper. It could not shout. And a radar that whispers does not see 100 miles. Zahl's answer was to stop fighting that geometry and surrender to it completely. If the wiring could not survive outside the vacuum, then nothing would be outside the vacuum. Into one cylindrical glass envelope went 4 triode tubes working in parallel, sharing a load no single triode of the day could carry, and with them their tuned circuits, the whole resonant heart of a transmitter, all evacuated together, all sealed in the bottle. Nothing hung outside where stray capacitance could kill the frequency. It was not a component anymore. It was an entire radar transmitter that happened to fit in a man's arms. When it fired, 20,000-volt pulses slammed through it, and it threw out 250,000 watts in bursts at 600 megacycles. The official history, never a gushing document, allowed itself one note of wonder. Remarkable power, it said, for a triode-type tube at that date. With Colonel Colton driving the work hard, the design came together. Then came the part that tells you what the rest of American industry thought of it. The contract to actually manufacture the thing did not go to the giants of the tube business. The giants had looked at a sealed glass cylinder holding 4 triodes and their circuits in one shared vacuum. A thing where a single flaw in any element scraps the whole assembly and passed. It went instead to a small firm on the West Coast run by 2 radio amateurs turned manufacturers. Men with a reputation for building tubes other people called unbuildable. Their names were William Eitel and Jack McCullough. Their company was IMAC, and they made the bottle by the hundreds. Around the labs, the tube picked up a name, the Zahl tube. The Army called it the VT-158. A young engineer named John Marchetti then built the radar around it, the breadboard set that would prove the whole idea. Keep both names. Zahl and Marchetti are not finished in this story, and all of it happened inside a wall of silence that occasionally had to reach out and silence other people. In the middle of 1940, Zahl spotted a paper about to be published by 2 physicists at Berkeley, Sloan, and Marshall, describing high power at almost exactly the secret frequency. Nothing in it stolen, nothing leaked. Just good physicists walking innocently toward the same door. Colton got on the telephone across the country, and an officer from the Presidio went to see the authors, and the authors, asked nicely in the name of a war America had not even joined yet, withdrew their own paper and let it be classified. No law forced them. They simply said yes. The secret stayed a secret in the most American way imaginable, by volunteers. By the time the bottle and its radar were ready to meet the sea, the test platform was waiting in New Jersey. A 125-foot motor ship called the Nordic, fitted out at Belmar as the prototype picket, the floating eye the canal had been promised. She steamed off the Jersey coast with the secret set aboard, and she never steamed alone. A Navy blimp hung over her, a destroyer kept close, because the one working copy of America's most advanced compact radar was considered too secret and too irreplaceable to risk on the open sea without a bodyguard. In Zahl's telling, the escort earned its pay. One day, a German submarine surfaced in sight of her, looked over a shabby little motor ship not worth a torpedo, and passed on, hunting bigger game, never knowing what it had just looked at. Zahl allowed himself one dry line about it years later. Hitler would have liked that prize. The set worked. From a platform 15 feet above the water, it reached out and found aircraft at ranges that long-wave radar could not touch from a hilltop, and it saw them low. The hole at the bottom of the fence was closed. The picket fleet had its eye. By any fair reading of the requirement, the project was a success, ready to sail south and take up station off the canal. And then the war it was built for evaporated. By 1943, the ocean itself had changed sides. The United States Navy and its allies had taken control of the offshore waters, and the carrier raid on Panama had slid from nightmare toward improbability. And at the canal itself, new eyes were arriving from a different branch of physics entirely. On Tabaga, the same island that had received one of those first crates in 1940, there now stood one of the first microwave search sets, a machine built around the British magnetron, and it saw low better than anything before it. When the new theatre commander, General Brett, flew in low over the water to show up the radar net the way visitors always had, he landed to find a complete plot of his flight waiting for him. Between a navy that ruled the approaches and microwave eyes on the islands, a picket line of radar boats no longer justified its cost. The requirement that had created the tube was quietly cancelled. The Nordic went back to ordinary work. No picket ship ever took station off either entrance. The most advanced compact radar in American service was suddenly a weapon without a war. It was airborne within weeks. On the 1st of March 1943, the lightweight set was flown to Orlando, Florida, to the Army Air Force's Tactical Center, because another part of the Army had developed an appetite for exactly what the canal no longer needed. The reason was the shape of the war to come. America was about to spend 3 years fighting its way ashore across 2 oceans. And the planners contemplating those landings had noticed an ugly gap in the toolkit. At the start of the war, the Army had no really portable early warning radar at all. The official history is blunt about it. The mobile sets could go only where heavy trucks could carry them, and shipping them over water and landing them was no light matter. Picture the first hours of an invasion. Thousands of men packed on an open beach, ships anchored in rows offshore, and the enemy's airfields 20 minutes away. Until the heavy radar comes ashore, days from now, the only warning of a raid is a man with binoculars. What the invasion planners demanded was a radar that could be broken into pieces a few men could hand carry, landed with the first assault waves, and assembled in an hour or two. The staff plans did not ask for a few. They called for upwards of 1,000 sets, with a priority above everything else in the radar program except identification gear. The seed of the answer had come from Britain, which had already built a crude, lightweight warning set of its own. In June 1942, a Signal Corps officer named Lieutenant Debenham flew out of Prestwick, Scotland, with 1,000 pounds of the British light warning set in the aircraft's hold, a cargo important enough that General Eisenhower's headquarters cabled Washington to announce the flight. Debenham worked on the American version until his death at Fort Monmouth, not long after, one of the quiet casualties of the radar war, a man who crossed an ocean with a radar in his care and never saw what it became. The Signal Corps copied the British set, improved it, and within a year, 10 lightweight variants were in the works at once, spread deliberately across different frequencies so that no single jammer could blind them all. And one of the 10 was different in kind. Into one variant, the Signal Corps put its own secret heart: the bottle, the Zahl tube, the 600 megacycle transmitter built for the picket ships. Where every other lightweight spoke in long waves, this one carried the picket program's 250,000-watt shout at many times their frequency, with the small antenna and the low-angle eyes that the tube made possible. It went into the books as the SCR-602 Type 8, soon better known by its newer name, TPS-3. A little lattice dish on a tripod that 4 men could set up in about 30 minutes. In early 1943, the Air Forces gathered the competing lightweights at Orlando and let the scientists and the visiting British ring them all out side by side. The verdict was not close. The Type 8, the tube's radar, was judged the best of the family. Full stop. The official report of the chief signal officer recorded a range exceeding 110 miles, from a set that came ashore on men's backs. The Royal Air Force sent a Vice Marshal's letter to General Colton asking for 200 of them, marveling that the designers had fit a receiver, a display, and a high-power transmitter into a single unit measuring 42 inches by 20 by 20. Orders piled up. Zahl would remember the number as 900 sets for American and British use together. And the Army's own historians would later rank this little radar as the Signal Corps' most substantial contribution to the field since its ancestral giants, the sets that had started American radar. Born for a picket line that was never formed, the bottle had found its war after all. Now it had to survive it. The lightweight family drew first blood early in North Africa in its first British-copied form. When the Allies landed there in November 1942, the first radar an American warning battalion managed to put on the ground was a lightweight set, hauled up a hill overlooking a captured airfield on the 8th day of the invasion, while the heavies were still fighting their way out of the harbour. The lesson repeated on every shore after that. The first eyes ashore were always the small ones. The family also learned the misery of its trade early. In North Africa, the lightweights were badly needed and often dead, waiting for a spare tube or a power unit that had not come ashore yet. And in the hills of Assam on the India-Burma frontier, crews found that even a set this small was hostage to terrain, useless in the mountain shadows, working only out in the open valley. A portable radar was still a radar. It saw nothing through a hill. But where the geography cooperated, the little set started writing history. On the 6th of June, 1944, The light warning sets went into Normandy close behind the first waves, ashore soon after H-hour by the official account, sweeping the low sky off the beachhead while the big sets were still crated in the landing ships. Zahl would remember 25 of the tube's radars crossing the English Channel for the invasion. 3 months later at Arnhem, 4 British-built lightweights, close cousins of the American set, rode the gliders into the airborne assault and died with them when the gliders were shot out of the sky. The lightweight went wherever the infantry went, and it paid the infantry's price. Its finest documented hour, though, came earlier in the Pacific, on a coral island few Americans could have found on a map. In February 1944, a marine outfit called Air Warning Squadron 1 landed on Engebe in Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, days after the assault troops took it from the Japanese. Their job was to be the eyes of the new airbase under Marine Aircraft Group 22, with its day fighters and night fighters and dive bombers. They had trained for it on Oahu, where one of their lightweight sets had been hauled up a mountain and worked off an elevation of 2,500 feet. On Engebe, there was no mountain. There was barely an island, a flat scrap of coral a few feet above the lagoon. So, the Marines built their own elevation, a 75-foot timber tower, and set a lightweight radar on top of it specifically to see low, the exact blind lane the tube had been invented to close, and ran a telephone line down from the tower into the fighter control center. The war diary of that squadron, typed up and filed away in 1944 and sitting in the National Archives today, records what happened in the first week of April. On the 4th, intelligence warned that enemy air action was coming. The squadron stood to. The following night, the Japanese raid came in, and the squadron's radars found it, tracked it, and talked the night fighters onto it in the dark. At least 2 enemy bombers were shot down under Air Warning Squadron 1's control. The raid was, in the diary's dry words, successfully intercepted and repulsed. The commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet sent down a commendation, and the diary names the men it landed on: Captain Torgerson, Lieutenants Thames and McClintock. 3 names on a page, standing in for a few dozen Marines on a tower on a coral speck who heard bombers in the dark and saw them anyway. Stop on that picture for a moment, because it is the whole story folded into one night. A tube built because admirals feared a night raid on the Panama Canal that never came. A radar built to ride picket ships that never sailed. And here, 2 years later and 5,000 miles away, the same idea stands on a wooden tower over a different ocean, doing precisely what it was conceived to do: catching the low raiders in the dark for a fleet and an island the original planners never imagined. The requirement died. The answer to it turned out to be portable. By 1944, the little set was simply part of the furniture of the war. It watched over beachheads in 2 oceans, and it guarded bomber fields in China for the new B-29s. A fact preserved in an Air Force photograph in the National Archives showing the tube's radar standing watch on a Chinese field. Marine Squadron rosters from that winter list a military specialty that did not exist 3 years earlier: radar operator, lightweight set, as routine as riflemen. The glass bottle that industry had refused to attempt was now government issue, and in the last year of the war, it was about to be handed a brand new enemy, one that did not fly. The reports coming back from the Pacific Island battles carried a statistic that the Army did not advertise. The weapon killing and wounding more American infantrymen than any other was not the sniper and not the machine gun. It was the mortar. By the accounting Zahl cited from the Pacific Command, mortars were causing more than half of the ground casualties in those campaigns. A mortar is a defender's perfect tool. It hides behind a ridge, behind a building, in a pit, lobbing its shells in a high arc, and from the receiving end there is nothing to shoot back at. You cannot see the thing. You can only count its hits. In the spring of 1945, with the invasion of Japan itself on the calendar, the problem landed on the radar men. And here Marchetti, the engineer who had built the first radar around Zahl's tube, noticed something that nobody had any right to expect. The tube's wavelength was about 50 centimeters. A mortar shell is about that size. To a radar, an object near its own wavelength in size is not a poor target. It lights up. The frequency that had been chosen years earlier to fit a radar onto a picket boat happened by pure dumb luck to be nearly ideal for seeing a mortar shell in flight. The idea was tested quietly on the New Jersey shore at Island Beach, tracking practice rounds in the air. It worked. A lightweight set could catch the shell rising, and if you could trace the arc, you could run it backward to the pit it came from. And then the hidden mortar was not hidden anymore. What followed was one of those bursts of speed that wartime laboratories were capable of, and Zahl set it down in detail. Working around the clock, Marchetti's team at Fort Monmouth turned a batch of the lightweight radars into mortar locating sets in, by Zahl's count, about 96 hours, modification kits, conversion, test, and all. The team's coordinator, a formidable woman named Helena Schroeder, ran the sprint and ran the telephone like a drill sergeant. And when a supply officer balked at her demands, she reportedly invoked the wrath of everyone up to the editors of Stars and Stripes. The finished kits went by truck to Newark Airport and flew to the Pacific. A production contract turned out 125 more. The tube that had been an early warning eye became a counter-battery weapon, and under its new designation, it served on into the next war, in Korea, hunting mortars in the hills years after the war it was built for had ended. Step back once, briefly, because there were two roads through the radar war. The famous one is the microwave road, the British magnetron, the great laboratory at MIT, the centimeter sets that won the night Atlantic. It earned its headlines. But that road took time, and the first years of the war could not wait for it. The bottle was the other road, available now, on a boat or a man's back. The magnetron won fame, the bottle won time. And the measure of it is that the men who had the magnetron in their pockets still chose to build, buy, and carry the tube's radar to the end of the war and beyond. The strangest thing about this weapon, though, is what happened to its secret. For 5 years, the bottle did not exist. The radar listings called its set just another lightweight. The tube itself, the thing that made the set possible, sat behind a classification wall, and the war ended with the public never having heard of it. Then the wall came down in the orderly American way. In November 1945, General Colton published the Army's first open account of radar in the engineering journals. 2 months later, in January 1946, Zahl and Marchetti themselves told the story of radar on 50 centimeters in the pages of electronics. The trade press finally allowed to print what a few hundred people had carried in silence. Years later, a popular magazine would sum the whole saga up in a single title: The Secret Tube That Changed the War. Zahl, who had a sense of humor about these things, might have preferred the title he later gave one of his own chapters: The Secret Everyone Knew. The canal the tube was born to guard was never attacked. For decades, that made the whole first act of this story look like wasted fear. It was not. We now know that in the last year of the war, the Japanese Navy was building giant submarines designed to carry strike aircraft, and that a plan existed to use them, and that the locks of the Panama Canal stood among its targets. The raid was never launched, but the fear had been right. The men of 1940 had anticipated the kind of attack the enemy would eventually plan, and the thing they built against it had long since gone on to other wars. The Nordic was returned to ordinary service. The picket line was never formed, and the battle-scarred glass bottle itself, the VT-158, was retired at last to the Smithsonian Institution, where it sits today, an unlovely cylinder of glass and metal that most visitors walk past without a glance. It guarded a canal from a ship that never sailed. It came ashore in Normandy and the Marshalls. It found the hidden mortars. It outlived its maker's war and fought in the next one. The men who carried it deserved the last word. Zahl, who built the impossible bottle. Colton, who drove it through. Marchetti, who kept finding it new wars to win. Debenham, who crossed an ocean with a radar in his care and never saw the end. Helena Schroeder and her 96 hours. and 3 names from a typed page in the National Archives: Torgerson, Thames, and McClintock, and the Marines on a wooden tower over a dark lagoon. None of this is from textbooks. It is from their war diaries, the Army's own histories, and the memoir Zahl left behind. We read them. If this story reached you, leave a word below for the men on the tower. They heard the bombers in the dark, and because of a glass bottle nobody would build, they saw them too.